commitment to social change, for ideals of justice, equality, and opportunity, and then abstain from, and discourage all effective action, for change. They are known by their brand: I agree with your ends, but not your means. They function as blankets, whenever possible smothering sparks of dissension, that promise to flare up, into the fire of action. These do-nothings appear publicly as good men, humanitarian, concerned with justice and dignity. In practice they are invidious. They are the ones Edmund Burke referred to when he said acidly, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Both the revolutionary leaders, or the doers, and the do-nothings will be examined. In these pages, the history of prevailing status quo shows decay and decadence infecting the opulent materialism of the haves. The spiritual life of the haves is a ritualistic justification of their possessions. More than 100 years ago, Tocqueville commented, as did other students of America at that time, that self-indulgence accompanied by concern for nothing except personal materialistic welfare was the major menace to America's future. Whitehead noted in Adventures of Ideas that the enjoyment of power is fatal to the subtleties of life. Ruling classes degenerate by reason of their lazy indulgence in obvious gratifications. In such a state the purposed 21 men may be said to fall asleep, for it is in sleep that we each turn away from the world about us to our private worlds. I must quote one more book pertinent to this subject. In Alice in Wonderland, Tiger Lily explains about the talking flowers to Alice. Tiger Lily points out that the flowers that talk grow out of hard beds of ground, and in most gardens, Tiger Lily says, they make the beds too soft so that the flowers are always asleep. It is as though the great law of change had prepared the anesthetization of the victim prior to the social surgery to come. Change means movement. Movement means friction. Only in the frictionless vacuum of a non-existent abstract world can movement or change occur without that abrasive friction of conflict. In these pages it is our open political purpose to cooperate with the great law of change. To want otherwise would be like King Canids commanding the tides and waves to cease. A word about my personal philosophy. It is anchored in optimism. It must be, for optimism brings with it hope, a future with a purpose, and therefore, a will to fight for a better world. Without this optimism, there is no reason to carry on. If we think of the struggle as a climb up a mountain, then we must visualize a mountain with no top. We see a top, but when we finally reach it, the overcast rises, and we find ourselves merely on a bluff. The mountain continues on up. Now we see the real top ahead of us and strive for it, only to find we've reached another bluff, the top still above us, and so it goes on interminably. Knowing that the mountain has no top, that it is a perpetual quest, from plateau to plateau, the question arises, why the struggle, the conflict, the heartbreak, the danger, the sacrifice? Why the constant climb? Our answer is the Heraclitus fragments. The waking have one world in common. Sleepers have each a private world of his own. Rules for radicals 22, same as that which a real mountain climber gives when he is asked why he does what he does. Because it's there. Because life is there ahead of you, and either one tests oneself in its challenges, or huddles in the valleys. In a dreamless day-to-day existence, whose only purpose is the preservation of an illusory security and safety. The latter is what the vast majority of people choose to do, fearing the adventure into the unknown. Paradoxically, they give up the dream of what may lie ahead on the heights of tomorrow for a perpetual nightmare, an endless succession of days, fearing the loss of a tenuous security. Unlike the chore of the mythic Sisyphus, this challenge is not an endless pushing up of a boulder to the top of a hill, only to have it roll back again, the chore to be repeated eternally. It is pushing the boulder up an endless mountain, but unlike Sisyphus, we are always going further upward. And also unlike Sisyphus, each stage of the trail upward is different, newly dramatic, an adventure each time. At times we do fall back and become discouraged, but it is not that we are making no progress. Simply, this is the very nature of life, that it is a climb, and that the resolution of each issue, in turn creates other issues, born of plights which are unimaginable today. The pursuit of happiness is never ending. Happiness lies in the pursuit. Confronted with the materialistic decadence of the status quo, one should not be surprised to find that all revolutionary movements are primarily generated from spiritual values and considerations of justice, equality, peace, and brotherhood. History is a relay of revolutions. The torch of idealism is carried by the revolutionary group until this group becomes an establishment, and then quietly the torch is put down to wait until a new revolutionary group picks it up for the next leg of the run. Thus the revolutionary cycle goes on. The purpose 23, a major revolution, to be won in the immediate future, is the dissipation of man's illusion that his own welfare can be separate from that of all others. As long as man is shackled to this myth, so long will the human spirit languish. Concern for our private, material well-being with disregard for the well-being of others is immoral, according to the precepts of our Judeo-Christian civilization, but worse, it is stupidity worthy of the lower animals. It is man's foot still dragging, in the primeval slime of his beginnings, in ignorance and mere animal cunning. But those who know the interdependence of man, to be his major strength in the struggle out of the muck, have not been wise in their exhortations and moral pronouncements that man is his brother's keeper. On that score, the record of the past centuries has been a disaster, for it was wrong to assume that man would pursue morality on a level higher than his day-to-day living demanded. It was a disservice to the future to separate morality from man's daily desires and elevate it to a plane of altruism and self-sacrifice. The fact is that it is not man's better nature, but his self-interest that demands that he be his brother's keeper. We now live in a world where no man can have a loaf of bread while his neighbor has none. If he does not share his bread, he dare not sleep, for his neighbor will kill him. To eat and sleep in safety, man must do the right thing, if for seemingly the wrong reasons, and be in practice his brother's keeper. I believe that man is about to learn that the most practical life is the moral life, and that the moral life is the only road to survival. He is beginning to learn that he will either share part of his material wealth or lose all of it, that he will respect and learn to live with other political ideologies if he wants civilization to go on. This is the kind of argument that man's actual experience equips him to understand and accept. 777 fifths is the low road to morality. There is no other. Of means and ends we cannot think first and act afterwards. From the moment of birth, we are immersed in action and can only fitfully guide it by taking thought. Alfred North Whitehead. That perennial question, does the end justify the means, is meaningless as it stands. The real and only question regarding the ethics of means and ends is, and always has been, does this particular end justify this particular means? Life and how you live it is the story of means and ends. The END_S, what you want, and the means is how you get it. Whenever we think about social change, the question of means and ends arises. The man of action views the issue of means and ends in pragmatic and strategic terms. He has no other problem. He thinks only of his actual resources, and the possibilities of various choices of action. He asks of ends only whether they are achievable, and worth the cost, of means only whether they will work. To say that corrupt means corrupt the ends is to believe in the Immaculate's conception of ends and principles. The real arena is corrupt and bloody. Life is a corrupting process, from the time a child learns of means and ends 25 to play his mother off against his father in the politics of when to go to bed. He who fears corruption fears life. The practical revolutionary will understand Goethe's conscience is the virtue of observers and not of agents of action. In action, one does not always enjoy the luxury of a decision that is consistent both with one's individual conscience and the good of mankind. The choice must always be for the latter. Action is for mass salvation, and not for the individual's personal salvation. He who sacrifices the mass good for his personal conscience has a peculiar conception of personal salvation. He doesn't care enough for people to be corrupted for them. The men who pile up the heaps of discussion and literature on the ethics of means and ends, which with rare exception is conspicuous for its sterility, rarely write about their own experiences in the perpetual struggle of life and change. They are strangers, moreover, to the burdens and problems of operational responsibility and the unceasing pressure for immediate decisions. They are passionately committed to a mystical objectivity where passions are suspect. They assume a non-existent situation, where men dispassionately and, with reason draw and devise means and ends as if studying a navigational chart on land. They can be recognized by one of two verbal brands. We agree with the ends but not the means, or this is not the time. The means and end moralists or non-doers always wind up on their ends without any means. The means and ends moralists, constantly obsessed with the ethics of the means used by the have-nots against the haves, should search themselves as to their real political position. In fact, they are passive but real allies of the haves. They are the ones Jacques Maritain referred to in his statement, The Fear of Soiling Rules, for Radicals 26. Ourselves by entering the context of history is not virtue, but a way of escaping virtue. These non-doers were the ones who chose not to fight the Nazis in the only way they could have been fought. They were the ones who drew their window blinds to shut out the shameful spectacle of Jews and political prisoners being dragged through the streets. They were the ones who privately deplored the horror of it all and did nothing. This is the nature of immorality. The most unethical of all means is the non-use of any means. It is this species of man who so vehemently and militantly participated in that classically idealistic debate at the old League of Nations on the ethical differences between defensive and offensive weapons. Their fears of action drive them to refuge in an ethics so divorced from the politics of life that it can apply only to angels, not to men. The standards of judgment must be rooted in the whys and wherefores of life as it is lived, the world as it is, not our wished for fantasy of the world as it should be. I present here a series of rules pertaining to the ethics of means and ends. First, that one's concern with the ethics of means and ends varies inversely with one's personal interest in the issue. When we are not directly concerned, our morality overflows. As Larochef put it, we all have strength enough to endure the misfortunes of others. Accompanying this rule is the parallel one, that one's concern with the ethics of means and ends varies inversely with one's distance from the scene of conflict. The second rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the judgment of the ethics of means is dependent upon the political position of those sitting in judgment. If you actively opposed the Nazi occupation and joined the underground resistance, then you adopted the means of means and ends 27 assassination, terror, property destruction, the bombing of tunnels and trains, kidnapping, and the willingness to sacrifice innocent hostages to the end of defeating the Nazis. Those who opposed the Nazi conquerors regarded the resistance as a secret army of selfless, patriotic idealists, courageous beyond expectation and willing to sacrifice their lives to their moral convictions. To the occupation authorities, however, these people were lawless terrorists, murderers, saboteurs, assassins, who believed that the end justified the means and were utterly unethical, according to the mystical rules of war. Any foreign occupation would so ethically judge its opposition. However, in such conflict, neither protagonist is concerned with any value except victory. It is life or death. To us, the Declaration of Independence is a glorious document and an affirmation of human rights. To the British, on the other hand, it was a statement notorious for its deceit by omission. In the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Particulars, attesting to the reasons for the revolution, cited all of the injustices which the colonists felt that England had been guilty of, but listed none of the benefits. There was no mention of the food the colonies had received from the British Empire during times of famine, medicine during times of disease, soldiers during times of war with the Indians and other foes, or the many other direct and indirect aids to the survival of the colonies. Neither was there notice of the growing number of allies and friends of the colonists in the British House of Commons, and the hope for imminent remedial legislation to correct the inequities under which the colonies suffered. Jefferson, Franklin, and others were honorable men, but they knew that the Declaration of Independence was rules for Radicals 28, a call to war. They also knew that a list of many of the constructive benefits of the British Empire to the colonists would have so diluted the urgency of the call to arms for the revolution as to have been self-defeating. The result might well have been a document attesting to the fact that justice weighted down the scale at least 60% on our side and only 40% on their side, and that because of that 20% difference we were going to have a revolution. To expect a man to leave his wife, his children, and his home, to leave his crops standing in the field, and pick up a gun, and join the Revolutionary Army, for a 20% difference in the balance of human justice, was to defy common sense. The Declaration of Independence, as a declaration of war, had to be what it was, a 100% statement of the justice of the cause of the colonists, and a 100% denunciation of the role of the British government as evil and unjust. Our cause had to be all shining justice, allied with the angels. Theirs had to be all evil, tied to the devil. In no war has the enemy, or the cause ever been grey. Therefore, from one point of view, the omission was justified. From the other, it was deliberate deceit. History is made up of moral judgments based on politics. We condemned Lenin's acceptance of money from the Germans in 1917, but were discreetly silent, while our Colonel William B. Thompson, in the same year, contributed $1 million to the anti-Bolsheviks in Russia. As allies of the Soviets, in World War II, we praised and cheered communist guerrilla tactics when the Russians used them against the Nazis during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. We denounce the same tactics when they are used by communist forces in different parts of means and ends. 29. The world against us. The opposition's means used against us are always immoral, and our means are always ethical and rooted in the highest of human values. George Bernard Shaw, in Man and Superman, pointed out the variations in ethical definitions by virtue of where you stand. Mendoza said to Tanner, "I am a brigand. I live by robbing the rich." Tanner replied, "I am a gentleman. I live by robbing the poor." Shake hands. The third rule of the ethics of means and ends is that in war, the end justifies almost any means. Agreements on the Geneva Rules on treatment of prisoners or use of nuclear weapons are observed only because the enemy or his potential allies may retaliate. Winston Churchill's remarks to his private secretary, a few hours before the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, graphically pointed out the politics of means and ends in war. Informed of the imminent turn of events, the secretary inquired how Churchill, the leading British anti-communist, could reconcile himself to being on the same side as the Soviets. Would not Churchill find it embarrassing and difficult to ask his government to support the communists? Churchill's reply was clear and unequivocal. Not at all. I have only one purpose, the destruction of Hitler, and my life is much simplified thereby. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. In the Civil War, President Lincoln did not hesitate to suspend the right of habeas corpus and to ignore the directive of the Chief Justice of the United States. Again, when Lincoln was convinced that the use of military commissions to try civilians was necessary, he brushed aside the illegality of this action with the statement that it was indispensable to the public safety. He believed rules for radicals 30 that the civil courts were powerless to cope with the insurrectionist activities of civilians. Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, while I must not touch a hair of a wily agitator who induces him to desert? The fourth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that judgment must be made in the context of the times in which the action occurred and not from any other chronological vantage point. The Boston Massacre is a case in point. British atrocities alone, however, were not sufficient to convince the people that murder had been done. On the night of March 5th, there was a deathbed confession of Patrick Carr that the townspeople had been the aggressors, and that the soldiers had fired in self-defense. This unlooked for recantation from one of the martyrs, who was dying in the odor of sanctity with which Sam Adams had vested them, sent a wave of alarm through the Patriot ranks. But Adams blasted Carr's testimony in the eyes of all pious New Englanders by pointing out that he was an Irish papist who had probably died in the confession of the Roman Catholic Church. After Sam Adams had finished with Patrick Carr, even Tories did not dare to quote him to prove Bostonians were responsible for the massacre. To the British, this was a false, rotten use of bigotry and an immoral means characteristic of the revolutionaries, or the Sons of Liberty. To the Sons of Liberty, and to the Patriots, Sam Adams' action was brilliant strategy and a God-sent lifesaver. Today we may look back and regard Adams' action in the same light as the British did, but remember that we are not today involved in a revolution against the British Empire. Ethical standards must be elastic to stretch, with Sam Adams Pioneer in Propaganda, by John C. Miller. Of Means and Ends 3:1 The Times. In politics, the ethics of means and ends can be understood by the rules suggested here. History is made up of little else but examples such as our position on freedom of the high seas in 1812 and 1917, contrasted with our 1962 blockade of Cuba, or our alliance in 1942 with the Soviet Union against Germany, Japan and Italy, and the reversal in alignments in less than a decade. Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, his defiance of a directive of the Chief Justice of the United States, and the illegal use of military commissions to try civilians, were by the same man who had said in Springfield 15 years earlier, "Let me not be understood as saying that there are no bad laws, or that grievances may not arise, for the redress of which no legal provisions have been made. I mean to say no such thing. But I do mean to say that although bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed still, while they continue in force, for the sake of example, they should be religiously observed." This was also the same Lincoln who, a few years prior to his signing the Emancipation Proclamation, stated in his first inaugural address, "I do but quote from one of those speeches, when I declared that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Those who nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I made this and many similar declarations, and have never recanted them. Those who would be critical of the ethics of Lincoln's reversal of positions have a strangely unreal picture of a static and changing world, where one remains firm and committed to certain so-called principles or positions. In the politics of human life, consistency is not a virtue. To Rules for Radicals 32, be consistent means, according to the Oxford Universal Dictionary, standing still, or not moving. Men must change with the times, or die. The change in Jefferson's orientation when he became president is pertinent to this point. Jefferson had incessantly attacked President Washington for using national self-interest as the point of departure for all decisions. He castigated the president as narrow and selfish, and argued that decisions should be made on a world interest basis to encourage the spread of the ideas of the American Revolution. That Washington's adherence to the criteria of national self-interest was a betrayal of the American Revolution. However, from the first moment when Jefferson assumed the presidency of the United States, his every decision was dictated by national self-interest. This story from another century has parallels in our century and every other. The fifth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that concern with ethics increases with the number of means available, and vice versa. To the man of action, the first criterion in determining which means to employ is to assess what means are available. Reviewing and selecting available means is done on a straight utilitarian basis. Will it work? Moral questions may enter when one chooses among equally effective alternate means. But if one lacks the luxury of a choice and is possessed of only one means, then the ethical question will never arise. Automatically the one means becomes endowed with a moral spirit. Its defense lies in the cry, "What else could I do?" Inversely, the secure position, in which one possesses the choice of a number of effective and powerful means, is always accompanied by that ethical concern and serenity of means and ends. 33 Science, so admirably described by Mark Twain as the calm confidence of a Christian holding 4 aces. To me, ethics is doing what is best for the most. During a conflict with a major corporation, I was confronted with the threat of public exposure of a photograph of a motel Mr. Mrs. registration and photographs of my girl and myself. I said, "Go ahead and give it to the press. I think she's beautiful, and I have never claimed to be celibate. Go ahead." That ended the threat. Almost on the heels of this encounter, one of the corporation's minor executives came to see me. It turned out that he was a secret sympathizer with our side. Pointing to his briefcase, he said, "In there is plenty of proof that so and so left bracket a leader of the opposition right bracket prefers boys to girls." I said, "Thanks, but forget it. I don't fight that way. I don't want to see it. Goodbye." He protested, "But they just tried to hang you on that girl." I replied, "The fact that they fight that way doesn't mean I have to do it. To me, dragging a person's private life into this muck is loathsome and nauseous. He left. So far, so noble. But if I had been convinced that the only way we could win was to use it, then without any reservations I would have used it. What was my alternative? To draw myself up into righteous moral indignation, saying I would rather lose than corrupt my principles, and then go home with my ethical hymen intact. The fact that 40,000 poor would lose their war against hopelessness and despair was just too tragic. That their condition would even be worsened by the vindictiveness of the corporation was also terrible and unfortunate, but that's life. After all, one has to remember means and ends. It's true that I might have trouble getting to sleep because rules for radicals 34. It takes time to tuck those big, angelic moral wings under the covers. To me that would be utter immorality. 777 sixth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the less important the end to be desired, the more one can afford to engage in ethical evaluations of means. The seventh rule of the ethics of means and ends is that generally success or failure is a mighty determinant of ethics. The judgment of history leans heavily on the outcome of success or failure. It spells the difference between the traitor and the patriotic hero. There can be no such thing as a successful traitor, for if one succeeds he becomes a founding father. The eighth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the morality of a means depends upon whether the means is being employed at a time of imminent defeat or imminent victory. The same means, employed with victory seemingly assured, may be defined as immoral, whereas if it had been used in desperate circumstances to avert defeat, the question of morality would never arise. In short, ethics are determined by whether one is losing or winning. From the beginning of time, killing has always been regarded as justifiable if committed in self-defense. Let us confront this principle with the most awful ethical question of modern times. Did the United States have the right to use the atomic bomb at Hiroshima? When we dropped the atomic bomb, the United States was assured of victory. In the Pacific, Japan had suffered an unbroken succession of defeats. Now we were in Okinawa, with an air base from which we could bomb the enemy around the clock. The Japanese Air Force was decimated, as was their navy. Victory had come in Europe, and the entire European Air Force, Navy, and Army were released for use in the Pacific. Russia was moving in for of means and ends 35 cut of the spoils. Defeat for Japan was an absolute certainty, and the only question was how and when the coup de grace would be administered. For familiar reasons we dropped the bomb, and triggered off as well a universal debate on the morality of the use of this means for the end of finishing the war. I submit that if the atomic bomb had been developed shortly after Pearl Harbor, when we stood defenseless, when most of our Pacific fleet was at the bottom of the sea, when the nation was fearful of invasion on the Pacific coast, when we were committed as well to the war in Europe, then the use of the bomb at that time on Japan would have been universally heralded as a just retribution of hail, fire, and brimstone. Then the use of the bomb would have been hailed as proof that good inevitably triumphs over evil. The question of the ethics of the use of the bomb would never have arisen at that time, and the character of the present debate would have been very different. Those who would disagree with this assertion have no memory of the state of the world at that time. They are either fools or liars or both. The ninth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that any effective means is automatically judged by the opposition as being unethical. One of our greatest revolutionary heroes was Francis Marion of South Carolina, who became immortalized in American history as the Swamp Fox. Marion was an outright revolutionary guerrilla. He and his men operated according to the traditions, and with all of the tactics commonly associated with the present-day guerrillas. Cornwallis and the regular British Army found their plans and operations harried and disorganized by Marion's guerrilla tactics. Infuriated by the effectiveness of his operations, and incapable of coping with them, the rules for Radicals 36 British denounced him as a criminal, and charged that he did not engage in warfare like a gentleman or a Christian. He was subjected to an unremitting denunciation about his lack of ethics and morality for his use of guerrilla means to the end of winning the revolution. The 10th rule of the ethics of means and ends is that you do what you can with what you have and clothe it with moral garments. In the field of action, the first question that arises in the determination of means to be employed for particular ends is, what means are available? This requires an assessment of whatever strengths or resources are present and can be used. It involves sifting the multiple factors, which combine in creating the circumstances, at any given time, and an adjustment to the popular views and the popular climate. Questions such as how much time is necessary or available must be considered. Who and how many will support the action? Does the opposition possess the power, to the degree that it can suspend or change the laws? Does its control of police power extend to the point where legal and orderly change is impossible? If weapons are needed, then are appropriate weapons available? Availability of means determines whether you will be underground or above ground, whether you will move quickly or slowly, whether you will move for extensive changes or limited adjustments, whether you will move by passive resistance or active resistance, or whether you will move at all. The absence of any means might drive one to martyrdom in the hope that this would be a catalyst, starting a chain reaction that would culminate in a mass movement. Here a simple ethical statement is used as a means to power. A naked illustration of this point is to be found in Trotsky's summary of Lenin's famous April theses, issued of Means and Ends 37, shortly after Lenin's return from exile. Lenin pointed out, the task of the Bolsheviks is to overthrow the imperialist government. But this government rests upon the support of the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks, who in turn are supported by the trustfulness of the masses of people. We are in the minority. In these circumstances there can be no talk of violence on our side. The essence of Lenin's speeches during this period was they have the guns, and therefore we are for peace and for reformation through the ballot. When we have the guns, then it will be through the bullet. And it was. Mahatma Gandhi and his use of passive resistance in India presents a striking example of the selection of means. Here too, we see the inevitable alchemy of time, working upon moral equivalence, as a consequence of the changing circumstances and positions of the have-nots to the haves, with the natural shift of goals, from getting to keeping. Gandhi is viewed by the world as the epitome of the highest moral behavior, with respect to means and ends. We can assume that there are those who would believe that if Gandhi had lived, there would never have been an invasion of Goa, or any other armed invasion. Similarly, the politically naive would have regarded it as unbelievable that that great apostle of nonviolence, Nehru, would ever have countenanced the invasion of Goa, for it was Nehru who stated in 1955, "What are the basic elements of our policy in regard to Goa? First, there must be peaceful methods. This is essential unless we give up the roots of all our policies and all our behavior. We rule out non-peaceful methods entirely." He was a man committed to nonviolence, and ostensibly to the love of mankind, including his enemies. His end was the independence of India from foreign domination, and his means was that of passive rules for radicals 38 sistents. History, and religious and moral opinion, have so enshrined Gandhi in this sacred matrix that in many quarters, it is blasphemous to question whether this entire procedure of passive resistance was not simply the only intelligent, realistic expedient program which Gandhi had at his disposal, and that the morality which surrounded this policy of passive resistance was to a large degree a rationale to cloak a pragmatic program with a desired and essential moral cover. Let us examine this case. First, Gandhi, like any other leader in the field of social action, was compelled to examine the means at hand. If he had had guns, he might well have used them in an armed revolution against the British, which would have been in keeping with the traditions of revolutions for freedom through force. Gandhi did not have the guns, and if he had had the guns, he would not have had the people to use the guns. Gandhi records in his autobiography his astonishment at the passivity and submissiveness of his people in not retaliating, or even wanting revenge, against the British. As I proceeded further and further with my inquiry into the atrocities that had been committed on the people, I came across tales of government's tyranny and the arbitrary despotism of its officers such as I was hardly prepared for, and they filled me with deep pain. What surprised me then, and what still continues to fill me with surprise, was the fact that a province that had furnished the largest number of soldiers to the British government during the war should have taken all these brutal excesses lying down. Gandhi and his associates repeatedly deplored the inability of their people to give organized, effective, violent resistance against injustice and tyranny. His own experiment of means and ends 39 ends was corroborated by an unbroken series of reiterations from all the leaders of India that India could not practice physical warfare against her enemies. Many reasons were given, including weakness, lack of arms, having been beaten into submission, and other arguments of a similar nature. Interviewed by Norman Cousins in 1961. Pundit Jawaharlal Nehru described the Hindus of those days as a demoralized, timid and hopeless mass, bullied and crushed by every dominant interest, and incapable of resistance. Faced with this situation, we revert for the moment to Gandhi's assessment and review of the means available to him. It has been stated that if he had the guns, he might have used them. This statement is based on the Declaration of Independence of Mahatma Gandhi, issued on January 26, 1930, where he discussed the fourfold disaster to our country. His fourth indictment against the British reads, "Spiritually, compulsory disarmament has made us unmanly, and the presence of an alien army of occupation, employed with deadly effect to crush in us the spirit of resistance, has made us think we cannot look after ourselves, or put up a defense against foreign aggression, or even defend our homes and families." These words more than suggest that if Gandhi had had the weapons for violent resistance, and the people to use them, this means would not have been so unreservedly rejected, as the world would like to think. On the same point, we might note that once India had secured independence, when Nehru was faced with a dispute with Pakistan over Kashmir, he did not hesitate to use armed force. Now the power arrangements had changed. India had the guns and the trained army to use these rules for radicals 40 weapons. Any suggestion that Gandhi would not have approved the use of violence is negated by Nehru's own statement in that 1961 interview. "It was a terrible time. When the news reached me about Kashmir, I knew I would have to act at once with force. Yet I was greatly troubled in mind and spirit because I knew we might have to face a war so soon after having achieved our independence through a philosophy of nonviolence. It was horrible to think of, yet I acted." Gandhi said nothing to indicate his disapproval. "It was a great relief, I must say. If Gandhi, the vigorous nonviolent, didn't demur, it made my job a lot." Reinhold Niebuhr, British Experience and American Power, Christianity and Crisis Vol. 16th May 14th, 1956, page 57. The defiance of the United Nations by India on the Kashmir issue has gone comparatively unobserved. It will be remembered that Kashmir, a disputed territory, claimed by both Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India, has a predominantly Muslim population, but a Hindu ruler. To determine the future political orientation of the area, the United Nations ordered a plebiscite. Meanwhile, both India and Pakistan refused to move their troops from the zones which each had previously occupied. Finally, Nehru took the law into his own hands and annexed the larger part of Kashmir, which he had shrewdly integrated into the Indian economy. The Security Council, with only Russia abstaining, unanimously called upon him to obey the United Nations directive, but the Indian government refused. Clearly, Nehru does not want a plebiscite now, for it would surely go against India, though he vaguely promises a plebiscite for the future. Morally, the incident puts Nehru in a rather bad light. When India's vital interests were at stake, Nehru forgot lofty sentiments, sacrificed admirers in the new statesman and nation, and subjected himself to the charge of inconsistency. This policy is either Machiavellian or statesman-like, according to your point of view. Our consciences may gag at it, but on the other hand, those eminently moral men, Prime Minister Gladstone of another day, and Secretary Dulles of our day, could offer many parallels of policy for Mr. Nehru, though one may doubt whether either statesman could offer a coherent analysis of the mixture of modes which entered into the policy. That is an achievement beyond the competence of very moral men. Of means and ends for one easier. This strengthened my view that Gandhi could be adaptable. Confronted with the issue of what means he could employ against the British, we come to the other criteria previously mentioned. That the kind of means selected and how they can be used is significantly dependent upon the face of the enemy or the character of his opposition. Gandhi's opposition not only made the effective use of passive resistance possible, but practically invited it. His enemy was a British administration, characterized by an old, aristocratic liberal tradition, one which granted a good deal of freedom to its colonials, and which always had operated on a pattern of using, absorbing, seducing, or destroying, through flattery or corruption, the revolutionary leaders who arose from the colonial ranks. This was the kind of opposition that would have tolerated and ultimately capitulated before the tactic of passive resistance. Gandhi's passive resistance would never have had a chance against a totalitarian state such as that of the Nazis. It is dubious whether under those circumstances the idea of passive resistance would even have occurred to Gandhi. It has been pointed out that Gandhi, who was born in 1869, never saw or understood totalitarianism and defined his opposition completely in terms of the character of the British government and what it represented. George Orwell, in his essay Reflection on Gandhi, made some pertinent observations on this point. He believed in arousing the world, which is only possible if the world gets a chance to hear what you are doing. It is difficult to see how Gandhi's methods could be applied in a country where opponents of the regime disappear in the middle of the night and are never heard of again. Without a free press, rules for Radicals 42 and the right of assembly, it is impossible not merely to appeal to outside opinion, but to bring a mass movement into being, or even to make your intentions known to your adversary. From a pragmatic point of view, passive resistance was not only possible, but was the most effective means that could have been selected for the end of ridding India of British control. In organizing, the major negative in the situation has to be converted into the leading positive. In short, knowing that one could not expect violent action from this large and torpid mass, Gandhi organized the inertia. He gave it a goal so that it became purposeful. Their wide familiarity with Dharma made passive resistance no stranger to the Hindustani. To oversimplify, what Gandhi did was to say, "Look, you are all sitting there anyway, so instead of sitting there, why don't you sit over here, and while you're sitting, say independence now." This raises another question about the morality of means and ends. We have already noted that in essence, mankind divides itself into three groups: the have-nots, the have a little, want mores, and the haves. The purpose of the haves is to keep what they have. Therefore, the haves want to maintain the status quo, and the have-nots to change it. The haves develop their own morality to justify their means of repression, and all other means employed to maintain the status quo. The haves usually establish laws and judges devoted to maintaining the status quo. Since any effective means of changing the status quo are usually illegal and/or unethical in the eyes of the establishment, have-nots, from the beginning of time, have been compelled to appeal to a law higher than man-made law. Then when the have-nots achieve success and be of means and ends 43 come the haves, they are in the position of trying to keep what they have, and their morality shifts with their change of location in the power pattern. 8 months after securing independence, the Indian National Congress outlawed passive resistance and made it a crime. It was one thing for them to use the means of passive resistance against the previous haves, but now in power, they were going to ensure that this means would not be used against them. No longer as have-nots were they appealing to laws higher than man-made law. Now that they were making the laws, they were on the side of man-made laws. Hunger strikes, used so effectively in the revolution, were viewed differently now too. Nehru, in the interview mentioned above, said, "The government will not be influenced by hunger strikes. To tell the truth, I didn't approve of fasting as a political weapon even when Gandhi practiced it." Again, Sam Adams, the firebrand radical of the American Revolution, provides a clear example. Adams was foremost in proclaiming the right of revolution. However, following the success of the American Revolution, it was the same Sam Adams who was foremost in demanding the execution of those Americans who participated in Shays' Rebellion, charging that no one had a right to engage in revolution against us. Moral rationalization is indispensable at all times of action, whether to justify the selection or the use of ends or means. Machiavelli's blindness to the necessity for moral clothing to all acts and motives, he said politics has no relation to morals, was his major weakness. All great leaders, including Churchill, Gandhi, Lincoln, and Jefferson, always invoked moral principles to cover naked self-interest in the clothing of freedom. Equality rules for radicals, 44 of mankind, a law higher than man-made law, and so on. This even held under circumstances of national crises, when it was universally assumed that the end justified any means. All effective actions require the passport of morality. The examples are everywhere. In the United States, the rise of the civil rights movement in the late 1950s was marked by the use of passive resistance in the South against segregation. Violence in the South would have been suicidal. Political pressure was then impossible. The only recourse was economic pressure, with a few fringe activities legally blocked by state laws, hostile police and courts. They were compelled, like all have-nots, from time immemorial, to appeal to a law higher than man-made law. In his social contract, Rousseau noted the obvious, that law is a very good thing for men with property, and a very bad thing for men without property. Passive resistance remained one of the few means available to anti-segregationist forces, until they had secured the voting franchise. In fact, furthermore, passive resistance was also a good defensive tactic, since it curtailed the opportunities for use of the power resources of the status quo for forcible repression. Passive resistance was chosen for the same pragmatic reason that all tactics are selected, but it assumes the necessary moral and religious adornments. However, when passive resistance becomes massive and threatening, it gives birth to violence. Southern Negroes have no tradition of Dharma, and are close enough to their northern compatriots so that contrasting conditions between the North and the South are visible, as well as a constant spur. Add to this the fact that the Southern poor whites do not operate by British tradition, but reflect generations of violence. The future does not argue for making of means and ends 45 a special religion of nonviolence. It will be remembered for what it was, the best tactic for its time and place. As more effective means become available, the Negro civil rights movement will divest itself of these decorations, and substitute a new moral philosophy, in keeping with its new means and opportunities. The explanation will be, as it always has been, times have changed. This is happening today. The 11th rule of the ethics of means and ends is that goals must be phrased in general terms, like liberty, equality, fraternity, of the common welfare, pursuit of happiness, or bread and peace. Whitman put it, the goal once named cannot be countermanded. It has been previously noted that the wise man of action knows that frequently in the stream of action of means towards ends, whole new and unexpected ends are among the major results of the action. From a civil war, fought as a means to preserve the Union, came the end of slavery. In this connection, it must be remembered that history is made up of actions, in which one end results in other ends. Repeatedly, scientific discoveries have resulted from experimental research, committed to ends or objectives that have little relationship with the discoveries. Work on a seemingly minor practical program has resulted in feedbacks of major creative basic ideas. J.C. Flugel notes in Man, Morals and Society that in psychology, too, we have no right to be astonished if while dealing with a means, e.g., the cure of a neurotic symptom, the discovery of more efficient ways of learning, or the relief of industrial fatigue, we find that we have modified our attitude toward the end, acquired some new insight into the nature of mental health, the role of education, or the place of work in human life. Rules Fob Radicals 46. The mental shadowboxing on the subject of means and ends is typical of those who are the observers, and not the actors, in the battlefields of life. In The Yogi and the Commissar, Koestler begins with the basic fallacy of an arbitrary demarcation between expediency and morality. Between the yogi, for whom the end never justifies the means, and the commissar, for whom the end always justifies the means. Koestler attempts to extricate himself from this self-constructed straitjacket by proposing that the end justifies the means only within narrow limits. Here Koestler, even in an academic confrontation with action, was compelled to take the first step in the course of compromise on the road to action and power. How narrow the limits and who defines the narrow limits opens the door to the premises discussed here. The kind of personal safety and security sought by the advocates of the sanctity of means and ends lies only in the womb of yogism or the monastery, and even there it is darkened by the repudiation of that moral principle that they are their brother's keepers. Bertrand Russell, in his Human Society, in Ethics and Politics, observed that morality is so much concerned with means that it seems almost immoral to consider anything solely in relation to its intrinsic worth. But obviously nothing has any value as a means unless that to which it is a means has value on its own account. It follows that intrinsic value is logically prior to value as means. The organizer, the revolutionist, the activist, or call him what you will, who is committed to a free and open society, is in that commitment anchored to a complex of high values. These values include the basic morals of all organized religions. Their base is the preciousness of human life. These values include freedom, equality, justice, peace, the right to dissent. The values that were the bane of means and ends 47 years of hope and yearning of all revolutions of men, whether the French Revolution's liberty, fraternity, equality, the Russians' bread and peace, the brave Spanish people's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees, or our revolution's no taxation, without representation. They include the values in our own Bill of Rights. If a state voted for school segregation, or a community organization voted to keep blacks out and claimed justification by virtue of the democratic process, then this violation of the value of equality would have converted democracy into a prostitute. Democracy is not an end. It is the best political means available toward the achievement of these values. Means and ends are so qualitatively interrelated that the true question has never been the proverbial one, does the end justify the means? But always has been, does this particular end justify this particular means? A word about words. The passions of mankind have boiled over into all areas of political life, including its vocabulary. The words most common in politics have become stained with human hurts, hopes, and frustrations. All of them are loaded with popular opprobrium, and their use results in a conditioned, negative emotional response. Even the word politics itself, which Webster says is the science and art of government, is generally viewed in a context of corruption. Ironically, the dictionary synonyms are discreet, provident, diplomatic, wise. The same discolorations attached to other words prevalent in the language of politics, words like power, self-interest, compromise, and conflict. They become twisted and warped, viewed as evil. Nowhere is the prevailing political illiteracy more clearly revealed than in these typical interpretations of words. This is why we pause here for a word about words. A word about words. 49. Power. The question may legitimately be raised, why not use other words that mean the same but are peaceful and do not result in such negative emotional reactions? There are a number of fundamental reasons for rejecting such substitution. First, by using combinations of words, such as harnessing the energy instead of the single word power, we begin to dilute the meaning. And as we use purifying synonyms, we dissolve the bitterness, the anguish, the hate and love, the agony and the triumph attached to these words, leaving an aseptic imitation of life. In the politics of life, we are concerned with the slaves and the Caesars, not the Vestal virgins. It is not just that in communication, as in thought, we must ever strive toward simplicity. The masterpieces of philosophic or scientific statement are frequently no longer than a few words. For example, E equal mc, to it is more than that. It is a determination not to deter around reality. To use any other word, but power is to change the meaning of everything we are talking about. As Mark Twain once put it, the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. Power is the right word, just as self-interest, compromise, and the other. Simple political words are, for they were conceived in and have become part of politics from the beginning of time. To pander to those who have no stomach for straight language and insist upon bland, non-controversial sauces is a waste of time. They cannot or rules, for radicals 50 deliberately will not understand what we are discussing here. I agree with Nietzsche's statement in the Genealogy of Morals this point. Why stroke the hypersensitive ears of our modern weaklings? Why yield even a single step to the tartuffery of words? For us psychologists, that would involve a tartuffery of action. For a psychologist today, shows his good taste, others may say his integrity, in this, if in anything, that he resists the shamefully moralized manner of speaking, which makes all modern judgments about men and things slimy. We approach a critical point when our tongues trap our minds. I do not propose to be trapped by tact at the expense of truth. Striving to avoid the force, vigor, and simplicity of the word power, we soon become averse to thinking in vigorous, simple, honest terms. We strive to invent sterilized synonyms, cleansed of the opprobrium of the word power, but the new words mean something different, so that they tranquilize us, begin to shepherd our mental processes off the main, conflict-ridden, grimy, and realistic power-paved highway of life. To travel down the sweeter smelling, peaceful, more socially acceptable, more respectable and definite byways, ends in a failure to achieve an honest understanding of the issues that we must come to grips with if we are to do the job. Let us look at the word power. Power, meaning ability, whether physical, mental, or moral to act, has become an evil word, with overtones and undertones that suggest the sinister, the unhealthy, the Machiavellian. It suggests a phantasmagoria of the nether regions. The Moe word, about words 51 meant the word power /s, mentioned it is as though hell had been opened, exuding the stench of the devil's cesspool of corruption. It evokes images of cruelty, dishonesty, selfishness, arrogance, dictatorship, and abject suffering. The word power /s, associated with conflict. It is unacceptable in our present Madison Avenue deodorized hygiene, where controversy is blasphemous, and the value is being liked and not offending others. Power, in our minds, has become almost synonymous with corruption and immorality. Whenever the word power/s mentioned, somebody sooner or later will refer to the classical statement of Lord Acton, and cite it as follows: "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." In fact, the correct quotation is, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." We can't even read Acton's statement accurately, our minds are so confused by our conditioning. The corruption of power is not in power, but in ourselves. And yet, what is this power, which men live by and to a significant degree live for? Power is the very essence, the dynamo of life. It is the power of the heart pumping blood, and sustaining life in the body. It is the power of active citizen participation pulsing upward, providing a unified strength for a common purpose. Power is an essential life force, always in operation, either changing the world, or opposing change. Power, or organized energy, may be a man-killing explosive, or a life-saving drug. The power of a gun may be used to enforce slavery, or to achieve freedom. The power of the human brain can create man's most glorious achievements, and develop perspectives and insights into the nature of life, opening horizons, previously rules for Radicals 52, beyond the imagination. The power of the human mind can also devise philosophies and ways of life that are most destructive for the future of mankind. Either way, power is the dynamo of life. Alexander Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers, put it this way: "What is a power, but the ability, or faculty of doing a thing? What is the ability to do a thing, but the power of employing the means necessary to its execution?" Pascal, who was definitely not a cynic, observed that justice without power is impotent. Power without justice is tyranny. Saint Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit order, did not shrink from the recognition of power when he issued his dictum: "To do a thing, well, a man needs power and competence." We could call the roll of all who have played their parts in history and find the word power, not a substitute word, used in their speech and writings. It is impossible to conceive of a world devoid of power. The only choice of concepts is between organized and unorganized power. Mankind has progressed only through learning how to develop and organize instruments of power in order to achieve order, security, morality, and civilized life itself, instead of a sheer struggle for physical survival. Every organization known to man, from government down, has had only one reason for being, that is, organization for power in order to put into practice or promote its common purpose. When we talk about a person's lifting himself by his own bootstraps, we are talking about power. Power must be understood for what it is, for the part it plays in every area of our life, if we are to understand it and thereby grasp the essentials of relationships and functions between groups and organizations, particularly in a pluralistic society. To know power and not fear it is essential to its a word, about words 53 structive use and control. In short, life without power is death. A world without power would be a ghostly wasteland, a dead planet. Self-interest, like power, wears the black shroud of negativism and suspicion. To many the synonym for self-interest is selfishness. The word is associated with a repugnant conglomeration of vices such as narrowness, self-seeking, and self-centeredness, everything that is opposite to the virtues of altruism and selflessness. This common definition is contrary, of course, to our everyday experiences, as well as to the observations of all great students of politics and life. The myth of altruism, as a motivating factor in our behavior, could arise and survive only in a society bundled in the sterile gauze of New England Puritanism and Protestant morality and tied together with the ribbons of Madison Avenue public relations. It is one of the classic American fairy